Hello and welcome to the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast. Are England back? An eventful week for Harry Brook's men against South Africa. Not very good in Leeds, competitive in London, and then record-breakingly brilliant in Southampton. Jacob Bethell has his first professional 100, and what a 100 that was. There were an epic set of quarterfinals in the Blast, and we'll be asking a title-winning analyst, what do they actually do? I'm Yas Rana, and with me today are Matt Roller from ESPNCricinfo and globe-trotting title-winning analyst Freddie Wilde, who joins us fresh off winning the 100 with the Invincibles earlier this summer and after winning the IPL with RCB earlier in the year. Great to have you on, guys. But first, we're going to head to Mark Butcher. Butcher, what do you make of that series? South Africa, who weren't ever at full strength, no Miller or Rabada throughout the series, no Janssen, no Gerald Coetzee, no Ngidi in that final game. They blow England away at Headingley, nicked a really good and fun game at Lords, and then lost by a world record 342 runs on Sunday. What were we supposed to make of
that? Well, 8th v 6th. That's what we're supposed to make of it. I mean, okay, go to the first game at Headingley where England were woeful. You know, the point you made about the players that South Africa didn't have on the field, and the fact that they blew us off the park as though, you know, it was South Africa back in the mid to late 90s when they were up there as among the very, very best sides in the world was pretty pathetic's not quite the right word, but it's pretty damn close. I mean, Headingley was full. It was, the other thing I was surprised about most of the series actually was that grounds like Headingley and Utilita Bowl and whatever, Lords, you'd always expect people to come. You know, it's big population in London. It's a prestigious day out as much as anything. But those two other places in the north and the south, where there'd been an enormous amount of cricket, with the 100 and various other things, test matches, Headingley and the rest of it, the people turned out in the numbers they did for a sort of a slightly meaningless one-off one-day international game. If you treat each venue and their one game as a one-off, which is what they are. And so the crowd turned up in really big numbers and watched a pretty crap performance from England in that first game. We had Owen Morgan and I had a bit of a discussion, and we're always slightly time limited in those because the presentation's ready and all the rest of it. We're in a situation, how good was South Africa and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, they weren't that good. You know, they weren't good enough to bowl. And England's batting lineup that has got that much talent in it for 130 in less than 25 overs. And that it was an awful performance. And then, you move on to Lords, and the big talking point around England's white ball team and their sort of reset under McCullum and Harry Brook has been their sort of reliance and their insistence upon having sort of like a four-man bowling attack with the addition of Bethell, the addition of Jacks, and the addition of even Joe Root at the outside if it gets to that point. And of course that's kind of what stuffed them at Lords, in that they had a terrific sort of first half with the ball, and South Africa were very much under control, and then England couldn't do anything to hold back the tide in the second half of the game when they kind of ran out of proper bowling options through the middle and towards the end. And almost chased it down, but almost wasn't quite good enough. So the series is lost. And then you get to Southampton, where all of the goodies, all of the promise and everything all comes together at once. You play magnificently on what is usually a very good surface down at Southampton. Bethell gets his first ever professional 100. Joe Root dips in. I think he's got 20 more hundreds in international cricket than the next best Englishman, who's Alistair Cook, which is just sort of mind blowing. England put 400 and something on the board. It was right back to the good old days of the Morgan era, and then in direct contrast to the comment about how good South Africa were with the ball at heading, England were unbelievable. Jofra Archer was incredible in that opening spell. South Africa needing so many runs or such a high strike rate from the very beginning. They had absolutely no chance. Jofra was awesome, cast bowled very, very well too. It's interesting, isn't it, though, when you put somebody like Brydon Cast has been very impressive throughout the summer in all of the formats he's played in. He's become kind of like a very reliable and a quite potent member of England's fast bowling ranks. And then you put him at the other end to Jofra Archer at the other end, and you go, oh my goodness, how big is the difference between Cast, who's very good, and Archer, who when he is at his best is incredible. So, mad series. England lose again. Not likely that we won't qualify automatically for the World Cup, but goodness me, we're making it difficult for ourselves at the moment.
I suppose when they're good, they're brilliant. They've scored 400 twice this summer in only 6 games. Morgan's team never did 400 twice in a calendar year. So it's more about, can they do what South Africa did at Lords, where South Africa had a difficult start. England bowled really well up top. South Africa battled hard to 120 for 3 at the halfway point. Brezka continued his brilliant start to his international career with another 50, his 5th in a row, first player to ever do that in ODI cricket. But they laid a foundation, and then from there, as England used their 5th bowler, they managed to get up to 330. I suppose that is where England haven't quite shown yet that they've made advancements recently.
Yeah, the sort of those batting smarts, I suppose. And when you listen to Harry, whose post match interviews I always take with a slight pinch of salt. It's almost like he doesn't really want to answer the question, so I'll just give you the same answer every time. Well, we're just gonna smash it, and then we're gonna bowl people out, and that's how we win. I'm sure there's more to it than that, even in the England dressing room. But you're right, the ability to kind of like perhaps be a bit more prescriptive. Look at the condition. Look at the opposition that you're playing against. Pick out weaknesses. Be a little bit more forensic in terms of the way that you go about taking on particular tasks, which is basically what tournament play is, isn't it? You don't go out there in a tournament, come up with the same sort of conditions against the same opposition every time and go out and play in exactly the same way. If that was the case, England wouldn't have won the 2019 World Cup final, because all of their preparation for 4 years leading up to that point, they had been able to play pretty much in the way that they wanted. But when it came down to the one game that they had to win the final, they couldn't do it because the conditions wouldn't allow it. And they were good enough and experienced enough and hard-headed enough, I think, to realise that, which is why even by the barest of margins, they managed to win that game. But this England group at the moment, that wouldn't happen. They'd lose that game and lose it comfortably, just by dint of seeing every match through exactly the same lens. And again, that goes back to the selection type thing as well. I think I don't mind the makeup of the side per se, because obviously batting deep gives you that little bit of extra leeway, and you might hope that, rather like Liverpool sides under Kevin Keegan, that all you need is to score one more. If the opposition get 5, you get 6.
Liverpool
however,
Liverpool sides against Kevin Keegan.
Yeah, sorry, against Kevin Keegan in Newcastle. Sorry, yeah, I was thinking of him as a player rather than as a manager, but you know what I mean. Having all rounders or having bowling options in your top 6, or even top 7 batters is obviously a great advantage. It's just which ones you choose, and in certain conditions, having your 5th bowler be Bethell and Jacks in seam bowling conditions doesn't seem to be very smart, really. And whether or not, Sam Curran obviously is somebody that has had his ups and downs at international level, but is constantly proving himself not only to be a very talented cricketer, which we've always known, but somebody that kind of rises to the big occasion, is a very smart cricketer with bat and ball, and perhaps somebody that should sort of permanently be part of England's sort of 12 and depending on whether or not they feel the conditions are going to be more suited to having a fourth bowler who bowls seam rather than spin, that he plays instead of one of Jack's and Bethell. Jack's they're quite happy to have down at number 7. So in that case, you'd have Curran at number 6. Or if you think that Bethell is slightly more talented at a more destructive role, then perhaps Curran goes in at 6 and Bethell goes in at 7. You can fiddle with it in order to get the best out of the two players and play an 11 that is more suited to the conditions that you come up with. And hopefully this series may have taught them that lesson a little bit.
A quick aside, you mentioned the really good crowds that we saw throughout the series, and you also mentioned that we potentially shouldn't take Harry Brooks' post-match press conferences too seriously and read too much into them. But at the same time, do you think sometimes that there needs to be, I suppose, a better realization of how much money people are paying for things? I found one comment a little bit jarring when Brooke, he wouldn't have thought about this. It's just something you say before a game. He just said, the series starts today at Lord's. And I was thinking, if I've paid a lot of money, it might be the one time I go to a live game and get to see England play this year at Headingley. I go home and someone asks me, how's my day? I'd say it was a waste of money and a waste of time. And for there to be no acknowledgement of that. And I think, by the way, the players have it really difficult at the moment. It was a brutal turnaround. 5 or 6 players were playing in the 100 knockouts the weekend before that first ODI. There was a 2-day turnaround between the final and that game. A lot of the players didn't even train and they've not played 50 over cricket for a long time. So I understand why circumstances weren't in their favour. But I thought the lack of acknowledgement of how crap that is for people who pay a lot of money to go, I think was a misstep.
Yeah, I felt that after the game, and usually I'm very. I go to games. I work on these games. I'm very lucky to do the job that I do. But generally speaking, come sort of the final piece of whatever my gig happens to be on the day, whether it's the presentation or the sort of like the talk down at the end of the game, the game goes out of my head and I'm kind of you're moving, you're in a car or something and you're moving on to the next one, and it doesn't bother me too much. It bothered me a bit ahead of me because I just felt that which is why I mentioned the crowd, really, that we ran into a lot of people trying to get taxis, trying to get away from Headingley at the end of the game, and people were very, very disappointed and quite rightly quite upset for exactly that reason. It's expensive, and they were looking forward to it, and they turned up in big numbers and were kind of let down. Now, listen, there's no. This is the thing with live sport, right? People during the course of the 100, or during the blast, it might, but for whatever reason, they might say, "Oh, there aren't very many close games. There's no, that there isn't enough tension. There's not enough jeopardy in these." Now that's live sport in any context, in any discipline, whether it's football, rugby, doesn't matter what the game is, whatever the sport. You are not guaranteed that you're going to turn up and you're going to get two sides that are going to go hammer and tongs at each other, and it's going to go down to the last ball or the last second of extra time, and you're going to get a result. That's not how it works. But there are times when you think you've kind of been a little bit shortchanged by a performance or the perception of the attitude of a performance. And I think perhaps at Headingley was one of those things.
Moving on to Sunday, very special moment when Bethell gets to 3 figures, his first professional 100. England's youngest men's ODI centurion since Gower in the late 70s. There's a lot of noise around his summer, the lack of cricket he's played, etc. But boy, he is some talent. And actually, despite being 5 years younger than the skipper, Harry Brook, he's taken to ODI cricket quicker than the captain. 104 50s from his first 13 knocks in ODI cricket. Brook, 106 50s from 32. It actually, given the 50 over cricket he's played, is an amazing start.
It is an incredible start, and it's it shows you why people, whether it be pundits, whether it be selectors or whatever, have so many high hopes or so much in the way of high hopes for him, because we can all see just how talented he is. I think the part of the reason why he's come under quite a lot of fire in the last week or so, 10 days or so, has been the thing around the captaincy. Obviously, I mentioned it one of the last times that we spoke, or when I spoke with Ben. And it kind of put him more in the firing line and more in the public's crosshairs than perhaps was necessary, given his relative lack of anything, his lack of any sort of three-figure score in any sort of cricket. Um, the tiny amount of flying hours that he's had over the course of the summer, etc. And all of those things, I think, added up to people sort of like starting to point fingers at him and saying, well, has he got a dossier full of incriminating stuff on 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 coach and captain that means that he gets immediately selected, all of which is very much unfair. But I think only came about because of the his elevation to being England's youngest ever captain. Because I think everyone is very aware of just how good Jacob Bethell is, can be, will be, and so therefore the extra pressure, the extra responsibility, and the garland. It's a big deal to be made captain of your country that he was given. Felt as though it was unearned, and people didn't like that very much, and he copped it for it. But we saw what he can do yesterday, and I think he averages what 40 in 50 over cricket. And considering he plays very little of anything, he's probably played less 50 over cricket than anything else, and seems to have taken to it like a duck to water.
Yeah, I think the thing with Bethel, he acknowledged before the game when talking to Stuart Broad that in an ideal world he probably should have played more cricket this summer when he was an unused playing member of that squad for most of that India series. There were opportunities for him to play the odd game.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I think actually when you look at his summer, it's a thing that we've talked about in the past when players go T20 only, batters go T20 only, and they just don't have much time in the middle. And if you look at Bethel's summer, it's not just the lack of games. You just look at the number of balls he's faced. There's only a handful of times he's faced more than 50 balls in an innings this summer, which if you think about it as someone who is seen as in England's top 8 test batters, is kind of mad. Anyway, it was a really good day for him on Sunday. A really tough day for another youngster in the opening ODI at Headingley, Sonny Baker on debut, torn apart by Aidan Markram, who was in some mood up at Leeds. Very difficult day for Baker. How did you see it?
Yeah, tough one, wasn't it? Because he'd had the almost the opposite to Bethel, whereby everybody was very much looking forward to seeing him in an England shirt. Um, Anybody that had seen him bowl over the last 18 months, and as I've mentioned before, first time I saw him was in Ghana on some very slow decks. You're just like, wow, this kid's got something that not many people have. He then has a pretty impactful 100, and immediately gets picked to play for England, which is pretty much what we as pundits and whatever all expected. We thought that England would have him in and around their squads, if not playing very very sooner rather than later. And he has an awful day. Your batters get knocked over for 130. The South Africans show just what an absolute road the pitch was. And then people who have never seen Sonny Baker bowl before, and there will be plenty of them who only sort of catch people when they play for England, will be thinking, well, what the hell's all the fuss about? This guy's just a county trundler, and that will be the last we see of him. It won't be the last we see of him. He will be back. It'll be a massive test of his sort of his mental strength, of which I think he has plenty to come back from that and to prove that there is a lot more to come from him, and that the selectors were right to give him a gig in the first place. So yeah, very very disappointing for him on a personal level. Disappointing for his family. I think his mum and dad were there, but he'll come back.
Yeah, we had him on the podcast before the start of the season after his excellent Lions tour. I know you spoke to him on Sky early in the summer as well. I say that he's got a very positive mental approach to life, not just cricket. And I
Yeah.
think specifically on cricket, he seems to have a really curious mind. I think he will really interrogate what didn't go right for him. And I think it's a bit of a lesson, I think, not just for him, but English cricket overall with the obsession with pace. 87 miles per hour gets you more than noticed in county cricket. Very, very few domestic bowlers bowl anywhere near that pace. That hurries even good county players. Aidan Markram, 87 miles per hour. He's fine. Aidan Markram's one of the best players of pace in the world. Markram hit what I think is one of the best shots of all time against Stark in an ODI once. He came down the wicket to a 92 mile per hour in swinger and hit him over mid wicket for six. So Markram is a very, very good player.
He is. He
Yeah.
certainly is that. Yeah. Yeah. Look. Sonny will have learned a lot, and he will now. If he had that inkling in his mind before that, okay, pace isn't everything, he now knows it. And I expect him to learn that lesson pretty quickly.
You're always an advocate for how good the Blast quarterfinals are. What a week! The
Yeah.
Bopara game at the Oval, the Livingston show, Lancashire, Sean Dixon playing the innings of his life at
Yeah.
Taunton. It always delivers.
Yeah. It does. Without trying to, rile people up about the 100 and versus the county game and all that kind of stuff. It matters to people still, doesn't it? The knockout games of county versus county and rivalries, in fact, that over the course of the Blast have seen very much action, very little action. Northants had only played Surrey once before. They smashed them in the final, and I think that's 2013. David Willey got 60 off 20 balls and took a hat trick. So that was the only time before that Northants had played Surrey. I think Hampshire and Durham, I'm not even sure they played against each other at all, maybe even only once. So even though you don't have these matches that happen often, and so there is no history of sort of rivalry between them, it matters. It matters to the fans. It matters to the fans to get to finals day, and it matters to the players as well. And so pretty much without fail, and I've been covering them for a long time now. They're always great nights, really, really great nights, and they didn't disappoint this time round. The Surrey game, for example, it was everybody was very surprised in the commentary box that game went ahead because particularly in the first innings when Surrey fielded, people there was water just flying everywhere. Every time a fielder went to ground, the ball was spraying in the air. They'd get up like they'd just jumped out of a bath. It was quite something that they got the game on at all. And of course that didn't help Surrey out a great deal. But then they could have batted first, and that would have been Northance's problem. And then you're not really legislating on Ravi Babara, 40 years old. So what were his words beforehand? Yeah, feeling a bit dead, not really feeling it before going out and getting a 40 ball 100. And then Surrey almost getting there with, again, the man that we keep talking about, Sam Curran, almost managing to get them over the line. Packed house. One of the things I suppose that's different about the Oval to everywhere else is that that partisanship isn't quite there as it is everywhere else. Big city, metropolitan. You have a lot of fans who just go there to watch the cricket, let alone be Surrey supporters. Not a long trip for the Northamptonshire fans. They made an enormous amount of noise and had the best night ever. And despite Surrey losing, and no matter what people think, I'm not that biased, honestly. But it was a brilliant game. The Hampshire Durham one was a little bit more one-sided, simply because Chris Lynn, who'd been playing club cricket in Brisbane, I think, and Toby Albert, who looks to be a real young prospect, almost put the game to bed in the power play. I mean, it was so devastating that Durham struggled to come back from that. And then the Lancashire thriller, not a great pitch. Kent somehow managed to get to 153. I mean, they kept losing wickets, but the scoring rate kept going, and they managed to get to 150, which could have been enough. They had just a little bit more quality with the ball. I mean, the interesting thing there for me in their defence was that they had the two spinners that Kent had to call on were both leg spinners. Now, on a deck such as the one at Old Trafford on that particular day, the leg spinners actually with that sort of extra, the overspin, the top spin that you get, just meant that the ball was actually a little bit easier to hit than some filthy undercutting left arm or off spinner. I know Livingston bowls leg spin. I know that, but he's a slightly different case, I think, because he can also then smash runs off not very many balls, and he played superbly. I think I said on commentary, the difference between the eye-catching innings that make great memes and looks fantastic on social, or fantastic shots that makes great memes and great gets great viewership on social media is completely different from playing those sort of match-winning innings. And if you saw him and you saw his reaction for a long time after the game was over, obviously he was ecstatic when the winning runs were hit, but he was kind of, he was so pumped for a good 5-6 minutes afterwards. No one could get anywhere near him. He was pacing around and throwing his stuff on the floor. He was just so, just so pumped up about what he'd achieved and what he'd done. That it was a magnificent performance. And then the one game that I wasn't actually on because we couldn't be in two places at once down at Somerset was a thriller again. And I suspect that Taunton was rocking. I would have been on the train back from Manchester. They sneak home. So you got two South group, two North group. The favourites are probably, you'd have to probably say Hampshire and Somerset, as they're both now in their 11th finals day. But as we saw with last year, very difficult to predict what happens on finals day. It's a tough old day. It's a strange old day, and sometimes it doesn't live up to the billing that the quarterfinals gives it.
Yeah, there's some amazing streaks around the Blast at the moment. Somerset have got to 5 finals days in a row. Hampshire 11 in the last 16. Warwickshire have lost 5 quarterfinals on
On the bounce. Yeah.
Surrey obviously haven't won it since the first year in 2003. On that Taunton game, there's a great video on the Somerset Twitter feed of every ball of that Sean Dixon innings. And it's brilliant because the crowd are so into it. And similarly at the Oval, I was there for that one. And you're right about the Oval not being as Parson as other grounds, but they were definitely pro Surrey for the first like 75 runs of the Bopara innings. And then
Yeah.
they realised what was happening. It's like, it's Ravi Bopara. He's the Karachi King head coach. He's not supposed to be doing this. And then they get so into it. And yeah, the first few people I told about the innings, including some people who work in cricket, their first reaction was, he still plays? What?
I mean, they were singing the song, they were oh Ravi Bapara, all on the train at Vauxhall as I was going past, walked past the Beehive, the entire pub was singing it. It was brilliant. It was an incredible night.
And a really good travelling support from Northampton as well. And the camera kept on pointing to the old boy, Nigel Felton.
No, Phelps, yeah. He texted me this morning actually to say thanks for the shout out. And he said it was his wife and daughter in the crowd, by the way. He wasn't having a Coldplay moment. But he said that they had a group of about 15 or 16 had come down, and obviously it had rained, so they'd been in the pub for quite a long time beforehand, which might have explained why he was he was giving it such a big one in the crowd there. But he had a great night as well.
And finally, just wanted to ask you about your new favorite social media page. I saw on Instagram you were prolifically sharing videos from the Cricket Archive page.
Oh yeah,
which is just stuff from the 90s and noughties. Yeah. It's great.
I don't know I don't know how they get the rights to put these things on, because stuff gets pulled down all the time. But there's some cracking stuff on there. Should check it out.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of competition for some of them. One of the first videos the account uploaded was highlights of Glenn Chappell's 6 for 18 in a cup final in the mid-90s. Like, I don't think anyone's putting in a copyright strike request there.
No, but I mean, so back in those days, the NatWest final was, played late on in the summer. 10:30 start. You basically won the toss, bowled, won the game. And that was pretty much how it went. But a hell of a lot of players. I'm trying to think of his name now. Ashley Cowan, I think, playing for Essex, did a similar thing, took 6 for or something in a NatWest final and got on the West Indies tour, sort of 97, 98 or something like that. Didn't play a test match. But Glenn Chappell was 6 for 18. And Glenn was a fabulous bowler. I always had an enormous amount of respect for him. But somehow never managed to play a test match, which is baffling to anybody that played against him during that period of time, because he was a proper bowler.
Cool. Let's leave it there. The T20Is kick off later in the week, so we'll have that to talk about next time round. So I don't know about you, but I've always wanted to go to Sri Lanka. I've had the pleasure of going to some amazing places through this job. I've been able to smugly say to my mates that I'm off to Barbados for work, but one place I've never been to but would love to visit is Sri Lanka. As it happens, England are off to Sri Lanka in the new year, and you can follow that trip, the 3 ODIs and 3 T20Is, immediately before the T20 World Cup with our friends at Gullivers Sports Travel. After England's behind closed doors tour in 2021, Gullivers are thrilled to welcome fans back to Sri Lanka in January and February next year. As the UK's leading cricket tour specialists, they'll take care of everything. So all you have to do is just enjoy the cricket in a stunning setting. Here's what's included: guaranteed tickets to all 6 games, plus match transfers, 15 nights in 4 and 5-star hotels with breakfast, stays in Colombo and Kandy, touring, optional international flights, welcome drinks, a tour group dinner, an expert tour manager to accompany you throughout, sightseeing excursions, and so much more. If you're interested, visit gulliverstravel.co.uk to book. Matt, what did you make of that ODI series? I thought it was quite a hard one to work out.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking if you bought a ticket for that first game at Headingley, you'd probably be pretty cheesed off with how the series panned out, given you had a real thriller at Lords that went the distance, went late into the night, and then had a world record spanking in Southampton on Sunday. So yeah, and the poor people at Leeds are probably thinking, why on earth did I bother paying 70 quid for a game that finished, 15 minutes after the floodlights came on? But yeah, as you say, quite a tricky one to evaluate. I think we obviously constantly having existential crises in cricket and wondering what the point of certain series are. I think there was an element of England using some of the 50 over stuff to learn a little bit about their T20 side. I think that probably explains the balance of the side to a certain extent. I think that's all with the upcoming T20 World Cup in mind, rather than thinking too deeply about South Africa 2027 as yet. But yeah, they're still not a convincing 50 over unit at all. And again, it feels like an England team whose results reflect the selection being based on the ceilings of players and not worrying too much about the floor. And I think, yeah, the nature of those results probably confirms that.
Speaking of high ceilings, Freddie, there was a very special and significant moment for young Jacob Bethell yesterday. His first professional 100. Only Gower has scored a men's ODI ton for England at a younger age. I guess interesting to ask you, what is it that people within the game see in Bethell that is so special? Because if you look at what he's achieved, it's quite different to what he's done on paper up to a certain point. So on paper, it's essentially unprecedented in the modern game for England's test number 3 not to have scored a pro ton. He's named England's youngest ever captain for the Ireland series, and you were part of the team that picked him in the IPL with RCB. He's the second youngest English player to play in the competition after Sam Curran in 2019, and even then, that was after Curran having an amazing summer with England. What is it about the professional game that is so excited about Jacob Bethell that has selectors and analysts salivating?
Yeah, well, I guess that there's kind of 2 parts to it, really, because there's the sort of statistical side of it, which is, I think, the one that people often talk about. Like you just referenced the fact that he never got a professional 100. I think that the way that Bethell has been picked and the sort of the evolution of selection in a way is actually sort of identifying that certain numbers matter more than other numbers. And like, quite frankly speaking, I think that I think, you've spoken about it a lot on the podcast and the media are aware of it. The performances in county cricket are not viewed in the same way as they were, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's more selective kind of statistics now that are probably driving players' selection. And even if it's just like performance in the 100, for example, being worth more than potentially sometimes performance in the championship, even maybe if we're talking about red ball cricket, just simply because the standard is higher, the stage is bigger, and players performing well on that stage it matters more. So from an analyst perspective, there are parts of Bethell's game where you look at his numbers and you can still go, well, this guy obviously has something because he's done well at a high level. The other side of it is slightly less tangible, and it's the side of it which is almost like you just watch him go about his business. And I'm an analyst; my job isn't really to be picking off that kind of stuff. But I've been around the professional game long enough now to be able to see what others see in that instance. And I wouldn't say I'm sort of qualified to make selections based on it, but if for example, when he came into the England setup, it was quite clear that he was different to other players who'd come into the setup, just in terms of the way that he would go about his work. For a player who I think at that age was only 20, maybe just 21 when he came in for the first time, he was, the preparation, his attention to detail was that of a far more experienced cricketer. And even from an analyst perspective, again, that is still something that I can sort of, to an extent, gauge, because players will come to me and ask for information, the questions that they ask, the way that they prepare. He just is cut from a different cloth. And again, in the IPL this year, when he was there, it was quite noticeable with other coaches who hadn't maybe seen as much of him, were like, wow, hang on, this guy is just different the way he goes about it. So that it's quite a hard thing to put my finger on, because, and like I said, I've tried to draw attention to some of the numerical stuff behind it. But as a person with a sort of background in statistics, I can still sit here and say, there is something about the way that he goes about it that I feel like is evidence that is worth holding on to. So it's slightly ineffable, slightly intangible, but he's clearly a hell of a talent, and I'm super happy for him that he got the 100 yesterday. I mean, the other thing as well is I think he's slightly a victim of his own hype, or not his hype, the media's hype. Like, he's now averaging more than 40 in T20 and ODI cricket and striking at above 100 in ODIs and 140 in T20 internationals. Like, he's done pretty well in a small sample of international cricket. It's just kind of that because he was held up at such a high standard early on, people are expecting him to come on, an average 45, 50 in test cricket straight away. And that's extremely rare. But I wouldn't be surprised if he got there at some point.
Alarm bells would have gone for some listeners when you said that 100 form might be in some ways more important than county championship form when it comes to picking the test team. Is that because the type of bowling you face in test cricket, you have more high pace guys that don't basically exist in the county championship? So even though the format is completely different, one of the things historically you just wouldn't know about a new England batter, for instance, is how do they go against really quick bowlers? Well, actually now, if you play in the 100, we have a good idea of that. Is that why?
Yeah, and look, I don't want to say that the only reason that someone might be picked is based purely off form in the 100. There's obviously the art of compiling an innings, and I think Beth was in the media this week saying that maybe he should have played a little bit more this summer. The art of compiling an innings and structuring innings is still obviously really important, but it's more that, as you said, we can learn things about their game from the 100 that we maybe can't learn from championship cricket, because they're just not facing the caliber of bowling. And yeah, pace is one of them, but I just think it's general quality as well. Like, you look at the number of brilliant new ball bowlers that are bowling in the 100, and there's plenty of them. And if you're, and I know that Beth's batting at the back end of the innings, but the point is you're still facing international caliber bowlers at both ends, and it's sometimes in championship cricket, you might face one, but you can see that out and then cash in at the other end. That's a lot harder in the 100, I think. So it's really just about the standard of play being a fraction higher. And again, it's not to say it's the only thing that matters. It's just, it does provide additional context that's more relevant to the international game.
Matt, the position that Bethell had success in this series was at 4 rather than 6, where he's batted previously in 50 over cricket. And I wonder if we don't talk enough about fielding restrictions in ODI cricket and how that impacts how difficult the job is in various positions. There are 4 men allowed out of the ring until the last 10 overs, when you're allowed 5 men out the ring, which means that you have less boundary protection in those middle overs. Speaking after the game yesterday, Bethell said there's always a gap in that middle overs part of the innings, and he's not talking about a gap to knock it 3 for 1. He's talking about a boundary option. And if you look at his boundaries, they're quite power play-y, if that makes sense, beating 2 men in front of square on the offside when there's no long off or deep cover. And there's a regulation change this year in 50 over cricket that it sounds like teams are trying to exploit. There was a good chat between Atherton and Broad on Sky about this yesterday. There's a ball at each end until the end of the 34th over. Then one of those balls is used for the last 16. And before it softens and reverses, and with that extra man in the ring, it looks like teams are properly targeting overs 34 and 40. Lords, South Africa scored 55 from those 6 overs. It's Southampton, England scored 67 from those 6 overs. So is it actually, for a young player making their way, is there a school of thought that batting at 4 actually might be a slightly easier gig?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that comment as well. I think it shows just how much of Bethell's cricket he's played with 5 men out. The fact that he was describing it as the extra gap with only 4 boundary riders. He's obviously got that grounding in white ball cricket so far, rather than the longer format. So yeah, it probably does feel like quite a big difference having that man up. And I think you've seen with the way he's taken down spin in particular, he's not necessarily someone who's going to be looking to rotate as much against spin, or maybe doesn't quite have that ability to get off strike that we see from, Joe Root's obviously at the opposite end of his career, but was so good at that in Southampton on Sunday. But yeah, he really took down Markram at Lords, and then probably more impressively Maharaj at the Rose Bowl. But yeah, I do think it's definitely an interesting nuance in ODI cricket. I think the rule changes will be really interesting to see how that develops, because we've obviously not had enough of a sample to make any real judgments yet on whether the ball change or sort of the move to the single ball at 34 overs is going to actually create the reverse swing that everyone has been saying it is. But we've already seen a couple of extremely high scoring games, both with South Africa having already sealed series in the past couple of weeks. But yeah, I will be interested to see how that develops and whether that is actually a trend that those 6 overs are ones that teams target in particular. But yeah, I think England do have some interesting decisions to make there going forward. We clearly talk about the balance of the side, and I think there's a pretty clear case that Sam Curran will come into the ODI setup at some stage before the 27 World Cup. I think it would be pretty useful for them to have an extra seamer so they can bowl up to 40 overs of seam instead of 30 overs of seam. But even if Curran comes in and is carded to bat 7, then yeah, fitting in Bethell, Brook, and Butler and working out what the best order is for them. It's going to be a real interesting dilemma, I think. Butler, obviously, there's always chat. I think Nick Knight is the biggest proponent of it on Sky's commentary. There's always chat that he should be batting up the order in ODIs, and I've always liked it as an idea that he could come in at 4. But then again, he's so good with 5 men back, and he's so used to that from T20 cricket that maybe actually, there's a case to leave him down and just have him to target the last 10. Brook again is a bit of a mystery at the moment in ODIs. He was obviously run out twice in this series, and had probably a quieter time of it with the bat than he would have hoped. And Bethell, yeah, has shown himself to be a pretty destructive player coming in that role, almost not quite a pinch hitter. That would probably be doing him down, but injecting some life into an innings at number 4. And it looks pretty obvious that he would suit batting with Joe Root as well. So it will be interesting to see exactly how that develops. And I wouldn't mind seeing Bethell as a long-term number 4, even if it meant Brook and Butler potentially facing fewer balls.
Freddie, Jofra Archer was irresistible yesterday. One of the spells of the summer. At one point, he had figures of 5 overs, 3 maidens, 4 for 5. And in general, it's just been so good seeing him back to his best this summer. There was a quick viz stat yesterday about his pace. It was his fastest ODI spell since 2019, an average speed of 89.5 miles per hour. And he often looks unplayable against left-handers, but less penetrative against righties. Yesterday, he looked lethal against both. I guess, why is there that discrepancy about how he goes against left-handers versus right-handers? And what can he do to be as effective against right-handers as he obviously was yesterday?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting topic, and I think it's something that's been spoken about in other formats as well, right? It's it's not just ODI cricket; we've seen it through the Test summer as well. He's a very effective bowler against left-handers. I think there's something in it that just the way Archer's natural release, his wrist position, and the movement that he gets, I think, is particularly dangerous for left-handers. So he's obviously got really high release point. He gets his wrist behind the ball in a way that sort of means he's moving it generally across the left-hander or into the right-hander. I'm not sure that was quite the way that he started off his career, but increasingly as he's gone on, you'll see that the way that, if he's bowling to a right-hander, he's generally tucking him up into his rib cage, which is why England often will have like a leg slip in position. And then to the lefties, he's obviously going across. And I just think that natural angle makes him a more effective bowler to the left-handers. He's probably challenging from over the wicket. He's challenging the outside edge really effectively. And from round, he can actually challenge both sides. And I think there's to an extent, his effectiveness against left-handers is actually just a product of the fact that he can go both over and round the wicket, whereas against right-handers, he's only going to bowl over the wicket, and it's a slightly more predictable angle. We've seen some right-handers be able to have success getting inside the line against him because the ball obviously then comes at them and they can help it on its way on the leg side, whereas for lefties, it's a lot more difficult to do that. So it might just be the fact that he's super good against left-handers rather than necessarily being particularly poor against the right-handers. Because I looked at his numbers in T20 cricket in the power play, and they're actually pretty similar. against right and left-handers. We've seen a slight discrepancy in 50-over cricket and Test cricket, as I've alluded to. But I think as much as anything, it's a super strength against left-handers rather than a weakness against the righties.
Matt, you wanted to talk about the schedule. It's not a proper weekly show without some mention of the schedule. It must have been so tough for the players turning around from the 100 knockouts that finished on the weekend, and then less than 48 hours later they're playing an ODI, different format, other side of the country, and barely any time to acclimatise.
Yeah, it's even worse for us poor journalists. I was at the 100 final on Sunday night and on the 9 a.m. train up to Leeds on Monday morning. Awful. No, I think it's worth bringing up in the context of Jamie Smith and Ben Duckett missing the T20s against South Africa this week, particularly because it's about a year on from Rob Key expanding McCullum's job from just the Test coach into an all-format coach, and at the time claiming that England's schedule was easing across formats. I think the specific thing that he was talking about was that there were going to be fewer tight turnarounds between Test series and white ball series, and fewer instances of, for example, last year when there was a white ball tour to the Caribbean sandwiched between two Test tours. But I think it's pretty clear that England's schedule is still unbelievably busy. I think Duckett and Brook as well, by virtue of the fact that Key has tried to lead this convergence across the two teams rather than the sort of Morgan and Root style divergence. They've played every international game that England have played since the start of the New Zealand tour, which was at the end of November last year. Smith, Brook and Duckett have all played 15 out of 15 home internationals this summer so far. And from my perspective, clearly it would be much more valuable for Duckett and Smith to have played a T20 series against South Africa 6 months out from a World Cup than it would for them to have played a 50-over series. But I think England probably didn't wake up to how knackered they were until they joined up with the squad in Leeds. And therefore have had to pull them out of that series at short notice, which means that England will be going in slightly under strength to a T20 series that should be pretty good preparation for that tournament. McCullum was speaking about it last night and said, I think he said it was the first instance he could remember of having, met a player for the first time in a series on the morning of a game. Some of those guys, came straight up the motorway on Monday afternoon, hardly saw anyone at the hotel on Monday night, and sort of first meeting of that series, I suppose, was at breakfast in the hotel on the Tuesday of the game. And clearly this is something that's going to continue as well. We had Richard Thompson, the ECB chair, on Sky on Sunday saying that sort of effectively conceding that there is a problem with the schedule and the tight turnarounds from the 100. It's going to be similar next year. It's, I think, 2 days after an India ODI series finishes, the 100 will start, and 3 days after that, a Test series against Pakistan will start. So it's going to be another squeeze. Clearly, private investors are rightly going to want England players involved because of the fact they've paid all this money for teams. They're not going to want them to say, they're not going to want to turn around and say, sorry, you can't have Ben Stokes and Harry Brook playing this week because we've got a test against Pakistan next week to prepare for. So it is clearly a problem which is going to keep on running. I don't really know what the solution is in the short term, other than perhaps England sort of recognizing that having different personnel across formats isn't necessarily something to be concerned by or worried about. I know Key has pushed really hard. I remember after the 2023 World Cup, he kept on saying, your best players are your best players. We need to have a stock of all format fast bowlers in the same way that Australia and India do. I think the nature of England's schedule is that maybe they don't, and maybe that's fine. That's my personal take on it anyway.
I just wonder if the approach to T20I cricket just becomes a bit more different over the years, because the best players typically are playing meaningful short form cricket. So it doesn't feel like they need to be playing a T20 series in conditions that are vastly different from the ones that come up in the World Cup. Whereas 50 over cricket is the only chance for these guys to play it. And we saw that even with arguably England's greatest ever ODI batter, Joe Root, in the years leading up to the 23 World Cup, he hardly played the format, and even Root needed some acclimatization. And look at how good he's been since he's come back, averages I think 88 this summer in ODI cricket. So yeah, he looks back to his best. Freddie, we've got a change to the England T20I squads. Sam Curran is involved, and it's a significant moment for Curran. He hadn't previously been selected in any England squad since Brendan McCullum had become coach. To England fans who wouldn't have seen that much of him in the last couple of years, what is he as a player now? Because they'll remember 2022 T20 World Cup, he's player of the tournament predominantly for the work that he does with the ball. But you've worked with him very closely at Oval, and he's become one of the standout batters. Forget the bowling, which is still very effective, but as a batter, he's a completely different option to what he was previously.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably largely of the fact that his role has evolved in time. I remember when he first came into the Test side in 2018, people spoke about the fact that he would evolve into more of a batter who bowled rather than a bowler who batted. And I think in the last couple of years in white ball cricket, we've seen that happen. That's not to downplay his bowling, particularly in the 100, which is still really effective. But I think that with the bat, both for Surrey, for Oval Invincibles in the 100, and also for the Desert Vipers in the ILT20, he's been given a role higher up the order. So rather than coming in that 6-7 role, which is where he's done the majority of his batting for England, sometimes even lower at 8 and being that seam bowler, sometimes a new ball seam bowler. Teams are now using him more through the middle with the bat, coming in that 3, 4, 5 area, having a few balls to get in and then kicking on through the back half. And we saw obviously how destructive he can be in that role in the 100. And then with his bowling, it's actually not taking the new ball as much, and his bowling more sort of the defensive overs, which to be fair, he has done quite a bit of for England. But it's just, I guess by being a jack of all trades and a master of none early in his career, it sort of meant that he was given a lot of different opportunities rather than being given one opportunity in one role that suited him best. Like, because he can do everything, he sort of does do a bit of everything and never really becomes a specialist in one thing. But I think in the last couple of years, as I said, in franchise cricket, it's been given a consistent run batting at 4, and he's really made it his own. As you said, I mean, even if you removed his bowling, you would be getting in that Oval Invincible side for his batting alone. And obviously adds a left-handed option as well, which for England is valuable. Obviously, the emergence of Bethell now means that they have got an alternative. But I know that you two both have listened to on the podcast have been, advocating for Curran to be batting more in the middle of the innings or in the middle of the order, and I think that's ultimately the thing that he started doing more of. The challenge is, and I think Baz has alluded to it in the media, I think the fact that he might end up batting higher up the order, maybe in future for England, is just that there's not been the spot there for him to do that. So as a result, he's been coming in lower, and that's not really been his best position. I think he can still do it, relatively well, but he's more at home at number 4, number 5, and it'll be very interesting to see whether England can find a spot for him in the next few weeks when he plays.
I actually think Curran really could be a key for England in unlocking the team balance as well for this World Cup. If you look at how they set up for the West Indies series in June, they had 2 proper seamers, 2 frontline spinners in Dawson and Rashid, and then we're relying on Jackson Bethell as the 5th option. Maybe you can get away with that a bit more in T20, and particularly when you consider the tournament's going to be in India. But I think the prospect of potentially having that little bit of cover from Curran to be able to bowl 1 or 2 of those 5th bowler overs, if you like, and considering him as a frontline batter, could therefore be the thing that gets him over the line ahead of another option, let's say Tom Banton or someone like that, batting at number 5 in the middle order. It's a shame, actually. I would have loved to have seen what England decided to do in terms of how they were going to structure the team if it was at full strength, because they obviously had an interesting call with Phil Salt coming back in, potentially moving Jamie Smith down. So it's quite hard to picture exactly what the sort of full strength T20 team is, and we might not find that out until the weeks before the World Cup. But yeah, I do think Curran has a huge opportunity over the next, week in particular, but 2 weeks with the Ireland tour as well to make a really good case, and I suppose prove to people that he's got better against high pace and the short ball as well, because I think that's been the question mark for his batting at the top level.
Yeah, just one more brief thing on Curran, actually, Matt. You mentioned there is his record against the short ball and against high pace. That was something I was going to say. It's just actually we have seen some evidence in the last couple of years actually that his numbers have got a lot better against that. I think he knew that it was an area that he wanted to work on, I think, and he spent a lot of time doing that. And in the last 2 years in particular, not only now is he sort of doing well against the short ball, but he's dominating it. It will be interesting to see whether the step up in pace and quality of international bowlers has any effect on that. As I said, the 100 often does a pretty good job of showing you what a player can do against that type of bowling. And then the other point I was just going to make on Curran as well, which again is a slightly going back to the Jacob Bethell sort of intangibles thing, that there is just something about Curran and the way that he goes about his business from he's an unbelievable competitor. And people say that all the time, but having worked with him again for the last, month in the 100, from day one there was one goal, which was he was winning this tournament again. And it's like a relentless pursuit of it. And it's seriously impressive and it's contagious for the whole group, really. I mean, his brother Tom is similar, to be honest. Both of them are sort of cut from the same cloth, unsurprisingly. It's just a sheer will to win. And it's a bit of a cliche with Curran, but he becomes more than the sum of his parts because he finds a way to win games of cricket. And for him, at this stage of his career, having spoken to him again, I know that he'll be super happy to be back in the England squad, and it's been a goal of his. But for him as well, the main thing is he just wanted to win trophies. He wants to be winning stuff. And I think that kind of attitude is super valuable, particularly for a team lately with England who haven't been winning as much. Just finding guys who know how to get across the line is really important. And I think that he will bring that to the team. So it's good to see him back.
Yeah, I also think, and again, it's another intangible, but he feels like he's almost got that Stokes-like quality in a run chase. He feels like one of the most dependable guys in working out what is required in innings and also taking responsibility. You can see it with him. He thinks a lot of the time, if I'm here with 3 overs to go, I back myself to get over the line. Obviously, that's a more difficult job in international cricket when the standard rises. But I do think in the last 2 years in particular, there's been a marked difference in his output in short form cricket. Before we ask Freddie some questions about his job, a reminder that we've been very busy on the old Patreon. There are dailies after every England game. There's a weekly extra show. And then on top of that, there's a weekly show on county cricket as well. The Discord community is fantastic. And if you like retrospective stuff, looking back at great scorecards from years gone by, it's the place for you. Yesterday, we were going through some of the best scorecards involving a teenage Ravi Bopara back in 2003. Some brilliant scorecards there, if that's your thing. Freddie, I saw a graphic shared on social media the other day from a cricket Twitter account with hundreds of thousands of followers. The graphic was a compilation of photos of you lifting trophies, the sort of thing that you might see on football Twitter when a club's new manager is announced. First of all, genuinely, congratulations. It must be very cool to have won those titles this year. And I'm not suggesting that analysts have the same prominence or importance as managers do in football clubs, but I was wondering, what is the role of an analyst these days? And do you have analysts who come to the job with an idea or philosophy for how that team should be playing their cricket, like a manager in football might like a certain system, or are analysts more reactive than that?
It's a good question. I think that there's a range of analysts. There'll be some analysts who don't have a philosophy about how the teams that they work for should play. Probably the ones who, as you get more experience, start to learn things that you've experienced that work, and you'd like to bring them to the table. But I mean, the key difference between the analyst and the manager, obviously, is the manager is the final decision maker. An analyst is one of them. And I think the better comparison to the football manager would be the cricket director of cricket. Or head coach. They're the people who enact the philosophy. But I do think that you're right to draw attention to like the fact that analysts can have that as well. Like I definitely have, I've worked, with professional teams now for probably half a decade, a little bit more. And my experience of doing that, there are things that have worked and there are things that haven't worked. And I know that it's not one size fits all, but there are definitely things that I feel like are worth suggesting and advocating for, and that's based on experience and data and the work that I've done. So, to an extent, there is a sort of a blueprint that I have in my mind of how I think that teams should play. I'll come to it. Sort of depends. At different teams, you have different levels of influence. At the Invincibles, I've been really lucky that I was involved from year one. I've struck up a great relationship with Tom Moody, been involved with all the drafts. We've together, it's been by far Moods' vision, but I've contributed to that, I think. And we've talked about things that we think work. And I've, had a considerable impact in sort of helping him shape that squad. But at the other end of the spectrum, there'll be times when you work as an analyst and your involvement in building the squad is far more minimal. Or you're one of multiple voices. So, for example, RCB, I wouldn't say I was key in shaping it, but I was one of the people in the room at auction time that was, involved in the discussions that ended up leading to the squad that we had. It was more Mo and Andy who are the decision makers there, slightly more removed than I have been at the Invincibles. But you have different levels of influence in different teams, and you try and bring your view to the table for sure.
I was going to ask you about squad construction and player ID at the Invincibles in particular. You've had a very settled group, and some of those names would have been to casual fans fairly obvious selections, like someone like Billings 5 years ago. He was in England squads. The Currans, very exciting players. Bill Jacks was talked about as one of the most exciting young players in the country. But there have been some other selections that people might not necessarily associate with how short form cricket works. I think a lot of people view short form cricket as teams get someone in on a short term basis as ready made products. But Oval have pinpointed some players as picks for the future almost, or players have developed. So Nathan Souter, we talked about him on the podcast last week. There was a point at which he didn't have a county, but was a key member of the Oval Invincibles squad. Twanda Muyeye, now he's one of the most exciting young players in the country. And whilst people have talked about him for a long time, his white ball record before this year wasn't brilliant, yet Oval picked him up previously. Jordan Cox is talk of the town at the moment across formats, but a few years ago, he wasn't someone who people were immediately talking about as a England white ball prospect. They knew he was exciting, but potentially not clear in exactly how he was exciting. So what do you guys look for in those players who essentially other bits of cricket haven't rated as highly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all three are slightly different. I mean, someone like Souter, for example, I remember before the first draft, he was someone whose T20 numbers were excellent. So I remember feeling like he was someone he was at Middlesex at the time. And in our prep for that first draft, I remember him coming up at that point, it was a backup leg spinner, and he was someone who consistently did well by the numbers. And I don't think there was, I'm sure some of the coaches who were involved in that first draft with us, with Vikram Solanki, Matt Walker, those guys would have, come across him in the county circuit as well, and no doubt advocated for him. But I remember him being particularly one who the numbers were quite clearly in favour of. And I think that, you're right. We've ended up sticking with these people throughout. They've been players who we've understood, trusted, known, and retaining them year on year out makes sense. Cox and Muyeye probably slightly different. Again, there was evidence that they were decent players, but I think that's more the Kent connection and the guys. Obviously, at the very beginning of the 100, teams had, I think, 2 or 3 feeder teams that fed into them. Ours were Kent and Surrey. And we've maintained strong links with both clubs throughout in terms of the players that we've brought in, which has just bred more familiarity, even like with coaches. So, for example, Matt Walker's been involved throughout. He's now obviously not at Kent, but he's been at Kent through that time, and he was aware of these players. So it's even just little things like he'd have been working with Muyeye through the season. Same with Cox. Same with all the Surrey guys and the Surrey coaches. So there's a consistency there that I think we've it wasn't really through design necessarily, but I think we might have been blessed in that Kent and Surrey had a handful of quite talented players. But being able to retain them year in, year out has been massive. And particularly, I think a few players have spoken about it in the aftermath of winning last week, which is just the environment that we've created. It doesn't feel like some franchise environments where you rock up and you sort of like, wait, I need to get to know who my teammates are, who are the coaches, who's the analyst. Everyone knows each other, and we've been able to just repeat it year on, year out. And obviously we've won the last 3, but even from the first couple, we've kept a very similar core throughout.
Are you worried then about the potential changes next year, and that one of the cool things about the 100 at its best is that there is that identity a bit more than some other competitions?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think that you do get this in all competitions when that there are, for example, in the IPL, there's a mega auction and there's a big refresh, and teams look very different. There'll probably be a few retentions, and there'll be some sense of identity that's maintained. Obviously, the fact that the branding and the team name and the colours are going to change. I mean, this is going to be a particularly different year. I think there is, that is a shame to an extent. But the downsides of the fact that, the Oval Invincibles are no longer going to be called the Oval Invincibles and might be called something else is outweighed by the fact that, we've got, people who have run cricket teams in India hugely successfully and are injecting loads of money into the game. That is the point of the private investment here. And I think that ultimately that's the pro that outweighs the slight con of a rebranding, which in time, I think people will probably move on from.
Freddie, having worked now in international cricket for a couple of years with England, as well as franchise cricket, how would you compare the two roles and how different they are? I suppose the most obvious bit is selection and recruitment is very different, but for example, I would imagine that at international level, it's a lot harder to find an obvious weakness for some top players than maybe in franchise cricket, where you know that a guy averages 10 against leg spin and you bring the leg spinner on.
Yeah, I mean, so your first point is definitely the key one, in that, drafts, auctions are a massive part of domestic franchise cricket, and getting them right is a huge thing. You obviously can't do that in international cricket. You can't just go and buy someone as much as you might want to. But selection is still important, but not in the same way. And I think, yeah, you're right. Weaknesses sometimes are a little bit harder to find. On the flip side, they are easier to exploit, because you've quite often got really good bowlers who bowl really fast, or mystery spinners, or whatever it might be. So you've normally got more weapons at your disposal in the international game, but you might just be searching for longer to try and find the weakness to exploit. But yeah, they are, and also they're different as well, in that a lot of the players who've reached international level are extremely aware of their own games in a way that at domestic level they're not. Like when I go to the IPL, sometimes, I'll talk to players who've had very little exposure to any kind of analysis at all. Versus in the international game, obviously these guys have been around the world and have had a lot of exposure to that kind of stuff. So that's another difference as well.
How tricky can that be in terms of the cultural difference? Because I imagine even simple stuff like when you're working with Rajat Patidar, I don't know how good his English is, but you clearly have a potential for a language barrier that you're not going to have with Sam Billings or Faf du Plessis or whoever else.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably one of the things that, since working in the IPL and in leagues around the world, has been the most eye-opening thing, is actually just the extent to which language, particularly in Asia, plays a massive role. Like you could come up with a fantastic bowling plan that is primed to exploit a weakness in one of the world's best players, and you're like, this is awesome. But then you actually sit down with your opening fast bowler, whoever that may be, and their English might be just to a level where it's actually really difficult to communicate that, and you might have to be going through a local coach who then translates it, and it's like the risk of losing information along the way. It's a hugely challenging thing that I didn't really think that much of until I got to India. I think for the first sort of IPL that I did, and I was something like, wow, like half my squad struggle to understand what I'm saying just because they don't speak English. And it's a huge challenge. And I think that language in the IPL is something that will develop, because I think you're seeing more and more teams now appoint more Indian staff. Like there was a big move early on with especially Australian coaches coming in and appointing lots of Aussie coaches. Now we're seeing there is more local influence and a respect for that, partly because it's really essential to communicate with the players. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges, and there's different teams provide different challenges. You don't obviously get that issue at the Oval Invincibles, but you do if you're working in the IPL, and you've just got to adapt to the different situations, really.
So if you're a budding analyst listening to this, get on a Hindi degree. That sounds like the way to go.
Duolingo Hindi, yeah.
Really basic question. Obviously, Joss Butler is really good, and you know that. You can look at the numbers, and anyone can say that. But how do you work it out for players whose circumstances at their teams might not allow them to flourish in the best way possible? So I'm just imagining someone had an amazing 100 for you guys this year, Donovan Ferreira. I can imagine a world in which he's playing for a team that's struggling and he's coming in the power play all the time, where he doesn't get an opportunity to show how good he is at the thing that he's really good at. And similarly with a bowler, they could be used in a different way. I'm just thinking in the Blast, you could have a guy who plays for a team like Somerset who are stacked and they have really clear role definition and they get to do what they're really good at. But you might have a guy who plays for a slightly less well-resourced team who has to do a bit of everything. So he doesn't get to excel necessarily. How do you work out? And I guess that's where the wins are for an analyst, right? If you can see that someone's really good when the raw basic numbers might not necessarily say that.
Yeah, definitely. And there are measures that account for the context that whatever is happening within. But even then, so for example, let's use the Ferreira example. Let's say he was playing for a team who kept coming in at 30 for 5 and kept sort of doing a decent rebuilding job. The numbers might flag that he's actually a better player than his raw stats, but he's still not, as you said, he's still not batting in the role that he would be signed for at a team if all things were going well. One thing that helps now is obviously the volume of cricket. There's enough cricket that means that he's not always going to be playing for the same team that's struggling. But that isn't the case for everyone. So Blast players is a really good example. Like, they might only play for their county, and they might keep on being used out of position. And that's where the sort of art comes into this. So it's a slightly more challenging thing than just looking at a spreadsheet. And my numbers will only be one part of the debate. You'd be working with, whether it's the likes of Mo Bobat and Andy Flower at RCB, who have got, a really good grounding in player ID, and being able to say, look, I think that this guy has got, something that it takes to thrive in a different role, and he's struggling in the team that he's playing in because he's coming in at 30 for 5. So it's a holistic approach to it. My numbers are one part of that debate, and various measures will try their best to identify that, and sometimes they can capture it, and sometimes they don't, and that's where you've got to rely on the other coaches and directors of cricket in the room to try and identify them. So it's a very much a team effort. I think that just saying you look at a spreadsheet and you can identify a player, that's not always the case. And I think if you thought you could, you'd be missing a lot of players as a result.
Obviously, from a global cricket news story point of view, RCB winning the IPL for the first time was a huge story early in the year. And I guess what was interesting from a team composition point of view is RCB actually had a really strong team identity historically in being very batting dominant and light on the bowling front. How did you guys turn it around this year? And what was it that you identified early on as being your priorities when you're going into the auction?
Yeah, I think you touched on one of it there. One of the things there is sort of addressing that historical imbalance between bat and ball, and I think also between overseas and domestic. Like, Virat's obviously been an incredible player for RCB. Until recently, he was the only domestic player to have scored more than 1,000 runs for the franchise. I think since then, Patidar and Padikkal have got there as well. But I think understanding that we needed to try and address the imbalance between that overseas and domestic spend that we'd had in the past as well. So we invested more money in domestic players than RCB have done in the past. We invested more money in bowling than RCB had done in the past. And I think looking at the side, it was a far more evenly distributed side in terms of where we were spending our money and where we were sort of putting our star players. We had an overseas batter at the top of the order in Seoul. We had David in the middle, Romario Shepherd as an all-rounder, and then an overseas fast bowler. It was sort of the quality was tried to spread it throughout. And also have recruit plenty of players with good IPL experience. The likes of Jitesh Sharma, Bhuvneshwar Kumar, guys who've played a lot of Krunal Pandya, who've played a lot of IPL, rather than sometimes you might have 4 or 5 guys who played loads of IPL cricket, spend loads of money on them, and then you're relying on some rookies to sort of come good. It can work, and teams have had success doing that, but it's not the way that we went about it this year. It's a slightly restructured squad. I think the emphasis was on balance throughout. But yeah, it was a great moment to turn that around and hugely rewarding.
Freddie, there's been a lot made of Andy Flower's success as a franchise coach in the past few years, and he was obviously with England, someone who really empowered an analyst in Nathan Lehman, who was probably one of the first sort of better known analysts in your line of work, I suppose. What was the experience like of working with Andy, and was he sort of as meticulous and focused on the attention to detail as is the popular conception, or has he changed a little bit as he's evolved into this franchise coach, and maybe slightly less intense than he was with England?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't comment on how he was when he was at England because I wasn't there, but my understanding is very much that he has sort of slightly relaxed in terms of his demeanor, and he's a lovely man, but he can at times be serious and laser focused. I think that's his strength, and I think talking about why he's been such a good coach, it is that attention to detail that does shine through, and it's even just like little things. If I'm having a conversation with him, you can't sort of lapse into cliches, because he'll be like, hang on a second, what do you mean by that? And you're like, whoa, okay, right. A lot of coaches, you can just, if you say something that is a cliche, they'll let it go. But he's completely sort of obsessed, I guess, with getting to the bottom of the debate that you're talking about. What is it that we are trying to solve here? How are we going to do it? And that attention to detail, and it's not just analytics, it's just a evidence-based approach more generally. So, that might be watching video. It might be making sure that you sit down with a coach and sit down with a player, and you're making no assumptions about what they think their role is. Let's just make sure he's completely certain that he knows what he's doing in this side. Where is he bowling, against this player? What's his field at the start of the game? make no assumptions and leave no stone unturned in sort of the pursuit of every little edge, and that's what he does, and it's brilliant. It's not too intense. I think that, as I said, I can't comment on how he was before. I enjoy working with him a lot, and I think so do a lot of players, because at the end of the day, he wants to win. That's the thing. He wants to win. He's driven by winning, and that's what a lot of players want to do as well. Or they want to do well, and he wants them to do well too. So once you understand that, it's not because he's a hard taskmaster because he finds that fun. It's because he wants to win, and I think that he's been brilliant to work with. So it's been a good relationship.
Next up, we've got a few listener questions for Freddie. But before that, a sponsored chat with Ollie Lawrence from the Periculum Security Group. Something a bit different for the next bit of the show. I'm joined by Ollie Lawrence from Periculum Security Group. Ollie, great to have you on. First of all, do you want to tell us what Periculum do and what Periculum's role in sport, in particular cricket, is?
Yeah, thanks, Yas, for having me on. Yeah, Periculum Security Group. So we're in essence, a corporate security and investigations company. So we support sort of the county game and county clubs and 100 teams with often, the back end, the business risk that exists, supply chain due diligence, risk and reputation around players, are often, with their public notoriety, face challenges that you and I wouldn't often face. So we help them navigate those challenges. We look at how we can safeguard and support CEOs at the top end of the game. They're often problematic areas in any business. We just happen to focus our business on sport. We talk about the hundreds of employees which are employed across the county game and across the 100. That presents challenges to CEOs. HR investigations is a massive area of our business. So we provide that layer of independence and support to county clubs across the United Kingdom.
Obviously, the domestic landscape in cricket is changing quite quickly, and part of that is the money that's come in from the 100 and the new owners that have come in with it. What's your involvement there in working with the counties at this time of change?
So it's always about understanding sort of risk and reputation, really, because obviously when you see the millions and millions of pounds coming into the game, which, let's be honest, has saved an awful lot of county clubs in terms of their ability to continue on in a successful manner and in a positive manner for the supporters, the players, and ultimately the infrastructure that exists around them. But when that sort of when the levels of money that come into the game that we're seeing comes in, the level of risk behind that, because you can sometimes get tunnel vision around, we got a deal here where sort of 45, 50 million. Ultimately, where's that money coming from? Making sure you get that KYC, that know your customer stuff. Are the individuals that are coming forward with these sums of money, are they people that we want to intimately get into bed with and support our club, our people, the ethos, and the way we want to play the game? So we're there to better understand the detail. We're there to get in amongst the reads, understand and make sure the right people are making the right decisions, and that ultimately these clubs and brands which have existed for hundreds of years are well supported and safeguarded through the work that we do.
And Michael Vaughan is involved as well?
Yeah, Michael's a close friend. He's our senior board advisor for sports and our brand ambassador. When I told Michael about the idea of Periculum Security Group in the early part of the year, he was very excited by what we had to offer, particularly to players and high-profile players when they come across issues. We're going to talk about a couple of those examples later on in the chat, but at a time of crisis, players have a myriad of different advisors that sit around them, often their agents and people close to them, family and friends. But we come in as sort of independent advisors, providing often that nuanced crisis management PR support as to trying to support with any particular narratives which need to be developed in order to support them. So because, we talk about the court of public opinion, that's around that risk and reputation. And outside of cricket in my professional life, most people that come to me with problems aren't so much necessarily these days worried about the outcome of court, bizarrely enough. They're worried about what's going to appear on page 1 of Google when you search those names. And when you're a high profile player who's already got a significant profile, when you run that search, it's equally important to make sure that the right stuff is coming up, and ultimately all the bad stuff we can try to control and remove if it's inaccurate.
One of the most high profile cricket stories of the last decade is, of course, Sandpaper Gate, 7.5 years ago now, early 2018. When you look at how that story unfolded, and it unfolded in such a dramatic way, you had proclaimants from prime ministers after it all happened. 3 players had year-long bans from the game, and there was a very, very high-profile aftermath of it. as well. From your perspective, what's your view in terms of how that situation was managed?
Well, I think what it goes to show is that cricket is a sport which is so highly regarded by people all around the world. To have an Australian Prime Minister getting involved in a matter like that just goes to show you the gravity of the impact that they think it has, not only on the team, but because it's a nationally representative team, the reputation almost on the country as a whole, really, people labelled, as Australia being this cheating side. But I think what it also demonstrated is soon thereafter, when we saw Cameron Bancroft, Steve Smith and David Warner giving their press conferences in a very emotive and emotional way, that there is a very human side behind these sports players who face unbelievable pressure, right? And I'm not condoning the behaviour at all, but there's an awful lot of pressure there. And sometimes we make poor decisions in however that's formed, but then we need to recover from it. And being able to support those players in a time of crisis is vital. Now, you've obviously got the authoritative bodies which exist. In this case, it was the ACB, but then you've got the players' welfare. Now, what increases in that, that the press level and the attention on increases tenfold. So we talk about private security, we talk about family, we talk about their children. All of these things have a massive impact on all of them. And what we try to do in that sort of scenario, as you watch on, I can tell you now, bubbles would have been formed around all of those players to insulate them and to try and support them through what was going to be a really, really difficult period. Now, I think we could quite comfortably say that all of them have come out of that issue fairly well by today's standards, all back playing, some nationally and some internationally. Obviously, David Warner's recently retired from the international game. But through the period in the last 6 years, there's been recovery building for their own professional reputations. And that takes time. And as independent advisors, we would often try to come up with the plan as to what we thought would be able to navigate that. You often find, rightly or wrongly, journalists forming narratives around sort of how something's happened, why has it occurred. And I've always been a big believer that you've got to try and manage that narrative as best you can to ensure it's truthful and accurate. So I'm not a believer in just battening down the hatches and hiding away and doing the whole emu head, ostrich head in the sand stuff. I think it's important to front those issues, but equally in a measured and responsible manner, because there can be legal ramifications equally to some of the conduct. But yeah, very, very complicated matter.
So just on Sandpaper Gate, so when the bans finish in 2019 and all three of them are playing cricket professionally and in some cases internationally once more, to the outside, to the fan, they've served their ban, they're playing again, that's it. But you're saying that actually behind closed doors, a lot of work would have gone on behind the scenes to ensure that return to the spotlight was managed carefully.
Tremendously so, because you not only got those professional livelihoods to think about, commercially you've got sponsorship agreements to think about, you've got all of those relationships to manage in terms of making sure that sponsors recognise that the player, the individual, has turned a corner, acknowledges and is making a difference and has come through, because that's really important, not only for one's own brand, but equally for the brands they represent, which, and at the end of the day, those relationships are worth a phenomenal amount of money to those players in terms of the commercial viability of them all. So there would have been a hell of a lot of work going on in the background to safeguard those, to continually communicating with stakeholders, which is both internal and external, to demonstrate that there was a plan, that there was a commitment to change, that there was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and then ultimately they're in a position of sort of rehabilitation in terms of being able to turn that back around. Because you look at the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of youngsters that watch the game of cricket and are inspired by one of, if not at the time, two of the best batsmen in the world in David Warner and Steve Smith. These decisions are going to have massive impacts, so I think it was important. And those plans would have been put together and would have been executed, what I can see from, very well, because I think they've come out of it, reasonably well considering.
And if anyone is listening to this and they want to hear more about Periculum Security Group, what should they do?
Yeah, so Periculum Security Group. So we've got a website, as you can imagine, www.periculumsecurity.group.com. You can find myself on LinkedIn, Oliver Lawrence, and equally, email address of info@periculumsecurity.group.com. And if we can help anybody, regardless of whether it's cricket or otherwise, then please feel free to reach out, and we'd be glad to sit down and have a chat.
Well, great having you on, Ollie. Cheers for your time, and listeners, will leave all the details to Periculum in the show notes. before we move on to the show, do you fancy winning tickets to finals day this weekend? We're giving away 2 tickets to the biggest event of the county summer at Edgbaston. Simply complete our short survey to be in with a chance of winning. We'll attach a link to that survey in the description of the show. We had quite a few questions in on a similar theme, essentially the difference between what teams talk about behind closed doors and how we talk about cricket in the media, and how cricket is presented on television. JP asked, what key metrics do you think broadcasters could be presenting in order for viewers to learn more about players or the state of the match in progress? Obviously, we've got WinViz nowadays, but aside from that, there's not loads on that front.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's obviously I used to work with CricViz, and some of my work there took me into the broadcast space, and it's a really interesting area because that cricket's a complex game, and there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and trying to take the viewer closer to that is, I guess with CricViz that was part of the goal. I mean, matchups is obviously one thing that's spoken about a lot, and I think that the game on TV can probably do better to communicate exactly what they mean by that, and I think that X type of bowling is a good option to this batter is about as extensive as we get in the media or on TV. And I think that going into slightly more detail on exactly what that means, and then I think crucially the implications for what that has on the rest of the game, because Rashid Khan's a good option to, every batter in the opposition order. Can't bowl every ball. So trying to understand, I think, having been on both sides of the fence, sat in commentary boxes, being the sort of analyst in the commentary box, and then also being an analyst with teams, is actually, and teams are obviously going to be more thorough because they're trying to win, whereas the TV are just trying to tell a story. But the thing I think that sometimes TV misses is actually just that, so, okay, right, if you're going to bowl him then so what? And particularly in a T20 innings, it's quite it's not mapped out, but it's more mapped out than other formats. And so if you make a decision to bowl someone early, it has an implication for something later on. And I think you need to be aware of that. And I guess the more that younger players start coming into commentary, we've seen Broad come into the commentary box this year. He's been excellent, but he didn't actually play that much white ball cricket towards the end of his career. The more Morgan obviously does, the more we have people like that in commentary boxes, I think they'll be better at articulating exactly kind of what I'm talking about there, which is there are implications to every decision. And I think you have to weigh that up, and it's about structuring the 20 overs. So I think analysis that incorporates not just this is a good bowler to this batter, but what does that mean for the middle overs? If you're going to bowl Rashid Khan in the power play, by all means, might be a good idea, but you're going to leave yourself short through the middle. And who have you got who can fill that gap in? So I think that's a key step in sort of broadcast analysis, probably.
Something I've seen a lot of actually in the IPL recently is that a lot of the time on the broadcast they'll have the individual sort of head-to-head matchup, which I think can sometimes be really enlightening. So, Liam Livingstone obviously has an amazing record in T20 cricket against Rashid Khan. It's a real standout. But I think also sometimes I feel can be quite misleading. So there's a sort of long-standing one in the IPL, which is Sandeep Sharma has got Virat Kohli out a lot. I can't remember the exact number, but I think he's not got him out for something like 5 seasons in a row now. But every time Sandeep Sharma comes on to Virat Kohli, the broadcast shows Sandeep Sharma has dismissed Virat Kohli X number of times in the IPL. But part of that is because of the fact that they've both been playing for a long time, and I don't feel there's much sort of predictive element to it. So I'm interested to hear, Fred, whether you think, and whether that's something you personally would use, if you have a sample of, say, 25 balls in all IPL cricket, would you think 3 dismissals and a particularly good head-to-head record is actually valuable and has a predictive element to it, or is it actually pretty irrelevant?
Sorry, just to jump in there before we go to Fred, I suppose broadcast is trying to do more than one thing, right? So it's not just a purely analytical tool. You think about some of the stats that get reeled off during football matches, Brighton haven't scored on a Thursday in October 1987, that sort of thing. That's not predictive. That's just a tidbit that you can get around.
And actually, and that the purpose of those head-to-heads, I guess, is partly to make people think I'm not going to go and pick up my pizza this over. I'm going to sit down and watch this because it could be interesting, and all of those spin-ons.
Yeah, it's a good point from Yas. I mean, it's important to remember what exactly a broadcaster is trying to do. But Matt, your question's a good one, and I mean, I think in simple terms, they are not that valuable simply because of the fact that the sample sizes are often so small. Like even I think that the biggest matchups, in terms of balls faced between two players is only in the hundreds. It might be a Narayan and a Pollard or things like that. And, hundreds of balls across not hundreds of games, but across tens of games, across over a decade of cricket with loads of different situations. It is really useful information to know when that player bowls against that batter, but it's outweighed, I guess, by other information. That batter's record against that type of bowling, or just whether that the quality of that player. Like Rashid Khan and Livingston's a really good example because we just went through that in the 100, and we had a very similar debate prior to the game against the Phoenix because we were aware of the fact that Rashid had a good record against Livingston, and maybe in hindsight we should have paid more attention to it. But at the end of the day, it's still Rashid Khan who's arguably the best bowler of all time. And it was really interesting listening to Livy speak in the media after that game because he was basically like, I can't pick him. I just get outside the line and I slog. And that might be Livy in Livy's way, downplaying his own ability because I think he's a hugely powerful player. He's got a great eye, and I'm sure there's more to it than that. But like at the end of the day, we backed our gun player against their gun player, and he came out on top, and that happens. And it doesn't mean it was necessarily the wrong decision because I think these, as Matt said, the sample sizes involved in those head-to-heads are very small, and generally just backing the underlying quality of the player matters more. So I think that's a general thing in analysis, full stop. Is like the way that cricket analysis has evolved across the last 10, 15 years is that, it's changed massively as an industry. And there's a tendency for all of us to sort of get stuck into the weeds because it's like, this is the really interesting nugget. Look, because I've got access to this data, I can tell you something that you don't know otherwise. So, well, actually, sometimes in looking for those tiny things, you're missing the bigger detail of like, it's Rashid Khan we're talking about. He's one of the best bowlers of all time. Maybe he should just bowl. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean it was wrong. So I think that's a really interesting part of analysis generally, which is like, actually don't lose sight of the bigger picture. And it's the same thing. And there's a huge debate. I think I've been on the podcast, Yas, with you before about like, where does Jos Buttler bat in T20 cricket? Should he bat lower? Should he bat higher? And sometimes, the sort of the answer that most teams have arrived at is just get him in the game because he's really good. Like that is ultimately the sort of and that's still really valuable analysis. If an analyst is bringing you back to that because you're getting stuck on, maybe his entry point should be X, you're still doing your job. It's just maybe a little bit more simplistic than you might have thought it would be.
Yeah, you pretty much answered the next question, which was from Fraser. Essentially, what are we hear all the time about someone not very good against one particular bowler or someone's very good against this type of bowling, and what are the other things that can be considered or should be talked about more in the media? I guess the thing for me that I always think that we are better at doing this now, but ground dimensions are just so different to how the cricket is played. I think we see that increasingly with England with our set number of international venues. I think there's a better understanding now of how the venues differ from each other. We see them all in the 100 as well, so there's a bit more scrutiny around that. But a game at Cardiff is completely different to a game at Southampton, for example. And depending on a player's strengths, you could get players who might get known as a Cardiff specialist in a few years' time. I don't know if that becomes more into it. I wanted to ask Freddie about how do analysts work with individual players about just improving their game more generally? You mentioned Sam Curran earlier and how he's improved against the short ball. Do you occasionally use numbers to help articulate a point to a player? Do players come to you and ask, actually, do I have a weakness?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was actually listening to a really interesting podcast recently with Michael Lewis, who obviously wrote Moneyball, and he there's a fascinating section about the fact that like the second wave of analytics, I think not just in baseball, but in American sports more generally, after the original Moneyball revolution, which was, signing undervalued talent and building a squad in that way, was actually like, hang on a second, we've got loads of information on our own players, making them better. So it's not just about signing players, it's about what have we got in front of us and how can we make them better. And I think it's often an overlooked area of analysis because you're even like in the preparation for matches, so obsessed with like, how do we stop this player that we actually don't always look what are the strengths of our own players. So it's definitely something that I'm conscious of trying to do more of. And yeah, players do come to you and ask for stuff. Quite a common question actually these days is, normally before a game, you sort of prepare these like one pages on opposition players. They go, I'd love to see what mine looks like for if we were playing against me, because it can help them work on their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's definitely an area that analysts should do more of. And sure, players are becoming more aware of it. And as I said, sort of touched on earlier, the generation of players now that have been brought up with this are far more likely to come and say, Freddie, do you think you could pull together some analysis on, my strengths and weaknesses, versus a player who at the start of their career, this didn't exist and they're still a bit like, well, I'm not sure I trust that, which you still get, which is fine. But I think as we move forward, you'll get more and more players who are willing to sort of get stuck into the nitty gritty. And that's great, because I think ultimately we're all, again, going back to like what I said about Andy, I'm just wanting us to win games of cricket, or I'm wanting the players that I work with to do better. And I think that once players understand that, and they increasingly do, it will lead to more open, frank conversations where they understand that's what you're trying to do. And there's no ulterior motive here.
I think we could talk for hours. It has been an hour, but it's been great fun. Matt and Freddie, thank you so much for joining the show this week. Fascinating stuff throughout. Listeners, we'll be back at pretty much the same time next week after the T20s against South Africa are all done and dusted.